At the age of 18, my dad said to me before I went over, this is none of our native Indians' business going over there fighting with the Germans. He said to me, if the white people want to fight amongst themselves, let them. You know, you have no business over there. I said, Dad, it's too late. I've signed my name on a dotted line. I'm going.
First thing I thought of, might as well join the army to protect my country and my family. My family first.
There was a guy by the name of Hitler that was taking one country after another, and it was just a matter of time that he would come to capture our king. And they talked about that, and I wonder what will happen. They said, if he comes across over here and take Canada, you know what, if we lose our homes, our reserves.
I was working, I was a sawyer in a sawmill in Flatbush. And all my friends and, you know, people I know were all joining the army, so I wasn't going to be left behind.
People were desperate in a lot of areas, no jobs, and the trapping was poor. So they were out to go someplace where they can make a living, get 3 meals a day, and they were also very proud when they put on that uniform.
It was my duty. I even thought maybe it was more my duty than anybody else. I had just as much right, more right to fight than anybody else because I was Indian. This is my country.
The world was at war, a war that reached into our homes and families. Our young men and women enlisted in the thousands. Some asked if it was our battle to fight.
I felt guilty for a long time for having served in the armed forces when many of our others resisted. Until one of my elders revealed at a meeting not too long ago, said that the first time that our people complained about having to serve in the armed forces, the government told them, well, you have an agreement with the Queen, and the Queen, she needs help today, because if she's defeated, your agreement goes down with it. So they went.
As sovereign states, Aboriginal nations declared themselves allies to the British Crown, from the Plains of Abraham to the War of 1812.
Aboriginal people don't go to war for imperialist notions. They're not out there to go out and say, hey, we've only got this much territory, let's go out and gain more territory. See? They'll go out for, defense. See? It was not to gain more land. For Aboriginal people, the whole view about land is really about relationships to the land. Their philosophy is that everything in the world is animate, and because it's all animate, everything in the universe is all interrelated. So when they're being brought into these skirmishes, into these battles, what's really at the back of the Indian's mind is somehow trying to maintain relationships with the land so as to bring about harmony and balance.
Our young soldiers saw service away from this land. They served with General Gordon in Egypt and in the Boer War. When the First World War was declared, Indian, Métis, and our Inuit brothers enlisted as volunteers. Joe Daniels volunteered, so did Private Martin and Private Buck. Corporal Francis Pagamagabo, the most decorated Indian soldier of the First World War. Olympic athlete Tom Longboat, and Private Norwest, who never came home. Most of the men and women served in the Army. The Air Force and Navy restricted enlistment until 1943. Some women joined the Canadian Women's Army Auxiliary. Mary Grey Eyes was the first Indian woman to enlist.
So I went in, and this officer's sitting there, and she's asking me questions, where I'm from, and I had my little wee certificate from school, I only went to grade 8. So she looks down at the little paper, that I was writing on, and she asked me all sorts of questions, and I answered them, and she ended up saying, lots of girls come here, he says, and they tell me they finished grade 12 and grade 13, and she says to me, and you know what? She says, you have more education than they have. So I was accepted.
In almost every unit in the Canadian Army, you would find our young men and women. Like soldiers everywhere, they left behind families and wondered when they would next see their land.
But one thing I'll never forget is that when I got on that boat in Halifax to go to overseas, that day stands out in my mind just like it was yesterday. Heading out into the gray ocean. And right then you do a lot of thinking,
When they arrived overseas, they waited for battle alongside their comrades.
Prior to that, I never left the confines of the reserve. Just stayed on the reserve, didn't know what the other half lived like. But when I did get into the Army, then I found out what other people were like.
I had black buddies, I had Jewish buddies, Scottish boys, English. We treated each other all the same, didn't matter.
They trained as medics and commandos. They worked as truck drivers and engineers, and they took in a little R&R. They would fight in every theater of war from Hong Kong to Dieppe, and they were there in Normandy.
We landed in Calais, I think they call it. And he just kept going. It kept going as far as he could. And then he said, you brace yourself, they tell you that. And then, come on, you guys, get out. So you jump out in the water, and it's cool water, And we got on top there was railroad tracks there, I remember that. And we come to a town there, and they had smashed that town. And this bulldozer has been clearing the road. Big bulldozers, American bulldozers, clearing the road, and you can see the bodies still laying there.
The hardest walk of my life I ever had is our mines. We had about 110 pounds of equipment on our back. There'd been a storm the night before, and the sea was swelling. They had 4,000 feet to walk on this little narrow path, only about 2 foot wide. The rest was for the trucks to go back. But I made it across there. And then all of a sudden I heard a noise in the back like a rapid artillery fire. And I dug a very narrow, shallow slit trench, just enough to lay down and flatten. And all of a sudden a bunch of guys run by my slit trench. They were screaming, so I ran behind them. And they were running for an advanced dressing station. They weren't bombing that area. And just then the bomb went off and they all dived into the slit trench, and I dived with them. So then I went back to my slit trench and found out if I had stayed there, I'd have been dead.
The one thing that really scared me more than anything was the smell. And it was right in the middle of summer, nothing was buried. There was horses, cows, humans, everything, but nothing buried. And that's what scared me the most was the smell. But don't think I wasn't scared of the shells, because I was. If some people say they weren't scared, they're lying.
I remember finding myself in a trench with my partner. We were told that we'd have to stay there for the night. And then all of a sudden it started raining so heavy that everything got wet. Everything we touched was wet. We couldn't even have a cigarette. And then bombing started to come. And the bombing was so awful, it just, the whistling and the sound of the bombing and never knowing where it was going to land. Between my partner and I, we had to sleep 20 minutes and wake up 20 minutes because one of us had to stay awake in the trenches. And I started to pray. I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. All I knew was Our Father and Hail Mary, and that's what I was praying.
Went back to camp and I'm looking for my buddy. And guy said he died. He said, he got killed. Oh, it took me quite a while to sink in. And that's it, my little buddy, no more. But I had lots of other, but time went on, you know. But this was a special little fella, you know, a special guy. And to me, it seemed like all the guys got killed were all the good guys. All the innocent type of guys got killed. And the guys who were a little on the bad side seemed to live, including myself. Well, anyway, it's war. That's what war is all about. I did see some terrible things.
At first, like when I went into the war, I thought I was dreaming. It couldn't be real. People couldn't do this. And when you realize that you're playing for keeps, then you think of your parents. I used to think of my parents. What if they get a telegram that I was killed, you know?
And I remember my mom listening to the radio every night because they would broadcast what was happening overseas. She would pray at night for her brother who was in the army, for her husband who was in the army, for her son who was in the army, for her uncles and her cousins. They were all in the army. And I remember she used to pray all the time about that. And we would go to sun dances. We snuck to sun dances. And it would take us sometimes 2-3 days to get to a Sundance because they were still against the law. And we'd have to travel at night and camp during the day and hide and not talk in the wagon on the way to the Sundance. And she went there to pray for these men.
They went over in, as I said, somewhere at the end of July or August 1940. And their first action was at Dieppe. They had a half a mile of stony beach, and then they had to make their way up this plateau into the city. I don't know just when he was killed, but the other brother was shot up, and a telegrapher from out to Hagersville came out there with these little yellow telegrams. There must have been thousands of them that were delivered across Canada, and sort of that brusque language there, regret, missing in action. That's the way he was classed. And then a couple months later in the fall, somebody came out again with a little yellow telegram. This time it was good news because it said he was a prisoner of war.
The war neared its end. Some of our men died. Some became heroes. A few never saw battle, but all wanted to come home to their land.
You move so much and you move on command that nothing impresses you. Even coming home, didn't get too shook up about that until we got to Halifax, and then it was something else. Those boats met us, those fire boats, and they were shooting those big streams of water up in the air, and a big bomber kept circling the ship. Then it started to get to be fun to be home, eh?
Back home to my reserve. I live at John Smith Reserve. That's 9 miles southeast of Prince Albert. Got back to my family. Oh, they were glad to see me back home. They were very glad. Everybody very glad. He made a big dance over me. Well, that was good. Very happy.
Sergeant Tommy Prince was a hero, the most decorated Canadian Indian soldier in the Second World War. He received 11 medals, including a Silver Star from the United States Army. He served in the elite 1st Special Service Force and would later see duty in the Korean War. Sergeant Tommy Prince was from the Broken Head Ojibwe First Nation in Manitoba. Many of our young men and women received honors. Men like Corporal Martin from Six Nations and Private George Monroe, who both received the Military Medal for Bravery.
There's my chance to save my buddies from getting killed. That's the reason why I done what I done. I went around the gully and just like hunting moose. That's what I hunted for them. Because I used to do quite a bit of hunting when I was young. I done the same thing. I hunted down for them. I got them, and since they get me. If you can get them first without getting you, you're the one. You're a hero, eh? I guess that's where they put it. But I didn't feel like a hero. No. Well, I felt proud of myself after I found out what happened. I I often think to myself, how did I do that? Well, that's very good.
We owe a great debt to these veterans, and I'm very sad about the way they were treated when I talk to them, about how some of them have lost their status as Indians because they participated in the war, how some of the reserve lands were cut off and given to white veterans, how some of the veterans were given lands in their own reserves. These were really awful insults that they had to endure.
It has truly been said that Canada's program for the re-establishment of war veterans leads the world. The film you are about to see centers on one part of this program, the Veterans Land Act. In it, you will see illustrations of how veterans are assisted in securing homes of their own and taking their rightful places in the life of the nation. There's no place like home. This is basic in the Veterans Land Act.
I'm not quite sure of what I'm entitled. No, he said a word. And of course, the other veterans that are not Native, they were told what they were entitled to, but not us.
When I come out of the Army, I did apply for a block of land that was available there. And I was told at the time that they couldn't sell it to me or lease it because it was a flood hazard. It was partly underwater in 1935. But while I was turned down for that piece of land, downstream along the Slave River, there was half a section of land there given out to an un-Aboriginal veteran. I often wondered why I was treated different being an Aboriginal person.
The meanest war veteran, as far as I'm concerned, they're forgotten. Not only by the provincial and federal government, but society as a whole.
I think we're all agreed that this man McLean's just the type we're looking for. You've all read the case. 4 years service overseas. He asks to be qualified to buy this house and 2 acres at Ancaster. A good property, close to the bus line, fine for vegetables or maybe chickens later on. The vendor asks $4,200. What do you think, gentlemen?
McLean looks a good sort of fellow to me. The kind of man who stands on his own feet.
Are you satisfied to recommend Fred McLean for qualification under the Veterans Land Act?
Yes, I'm quite satisfied. When our veterans came home, the Department of Veterans Affairs turned over the treatment of Indian veterans to the Department of Indian Affairs, and they just botched it up. They did a very bad job of handling it.
Inside of a year, I got a fully furnished house, and I'm married. Now my wife's a little baby, already 3 months old. And then came the biggest shock of my life, and one day this knock at the door, and this young man looked there, a well-dressed man, very authoritative voice on him. He knew who I was, he knew where I came from, and I thought to myself, he's probably from Indian Affairs. He's come to shake my hand and give me a pat on the back for doing so good for myself. And he said, "You're Wilford Brass?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Do you know that you have this, you own your house?" "Yes, my house. I paid cash for it." "Do you know that you violated the law?" "What law?" He says, a treaty Indian says can't own any property. Then I was a little bit annoyed because it's only 2 years since I got my discharge. So I said, "You mean to tell me that fighting for the war for this country, that I can't have no right to own property?" He said, "No, you have no right." And a couple of months later, I got this card. I was showing you about this in France. So I'm not an Indian anymore. I'm enfranchised, but I don't know what to call myself, It says on there now I can vote, and I enjoy all the privileges of His Majesty's subjects, you see. So I guess, in other words, I guess I made myself a first-class citizen by doing that, but I've lost my rights as an Indian, see.
I don't have to be called a hero every day, but I want equal terms as anybody else. But I can't seem to get it.
There were Native soldiers who received the benefits available to other Canadian soldiers. But overall, the record is dismal. Whether land grants or training programs, civil service jobs, or family benefits, information was withheld or programs were simply not applied. And it was not just soldiers who were affected. First Nations communities lost land.
The government of Canada, under the Soldier Settlement Act, was going to give lands at a very cheap price to returning veterans. They ended up zeroing in many, many cases, on Indian reserve lands. And without telling the Indians what it was all about, one way or another persuaded a whole band to surrender parts of their reserves.
I don't understand that. Why? Why they take our land away from us in the Montney Reserve and give it to the veterans? Why?
When I go by Mountain, I just about to cry for it. I just look at it. We love it in there. We love our land.
The entire Montney Reserve was taken through the Soldier Settlement Act and sold to non-native war veterans.
This is former IR-172 Montney, 18,000 acres, a little over 18,000 acres. We lived there for the last 500-600 years, maybe more, up to 1945. There's an oil pool just over here at the west end boundary. And there's about 60 wells there today. 42 farmers in BC own the mineral rights. $500 million came out of there, just the royalty for oil. This is where they put us back in 1950, after we lost a reserve. For 5 years, we didn't have a reserve. They moved us here and they built a schoolhouse right here. This is where I went to school. We come here in the morning, and then we stand around the pot-belly stove before we warm up our hands and before we take our desk. That desk was really cold. And I remember a teacher rubbed his hand together before we sang the "O Canada" in the morning to start the school.
If I kept your house, I guess I'm a trustee to that place, to you. You go for a holiday. And in the meanwhile, I sold your place. You come back, you got no place to go.
After years of court battles, the Blueberry and Doig First Nations in northern British Columbia finally won their case for compensation. In Ipperwash, Ontario, the Stony Point First Nations lost their lands through the War Measures Act. Their land became a military base that was to be returned after the war.
We had to ask for permission to go back to the graveyards, because my mother's buried there, and I got a few of my sisters and a brother. There was trenches dug in our graveyard. Trenches, and some of the bottom stones were shot up, with rifle shots. and it was horrible the way there was one family living way back in the bush there. When the army moved in, and they were firing, and then all at once, even the army tells you this, that they didn't know there was a family living back there. Kids running in front of their firing, and they stopped it, and they said, "Holy jeez, there's a family living here."
Clifford George served in the Canadian Army in the Second World War. He helped lead the peaceful return of his people to Ipperwash.
Because my dad wrote to me several times, and he said, "Don't worry, son, as soon as you come back, your land will be here." But I went overseas in good faith, and I fought for them in good faith, and I come back home to nothing.
During a demonstration at Stony Point, Dudley George was killed by the Ontario police.
All of these problems ended up having very devastating results, sometimes tragic results for individual veterans and so on. And of course, the government at the present is denying responsibility. They're denying the fact that the Indians didn't have to lose Indian status and so forth.
The irony of Aboriginal soldiers fighting a war against the oppression of fascism, giving their lives for that, and coming home to face oppressive fascism.
When I come back from overseas, they wouldn't allow us to go curling, they wouldn't allow us to go golfing in this town where I was. And when you went to the show, the Indians used to have to sit on one side of the picture show, you know. I came to have a terrific inferiority complex. I couldn't look anybody in the eye. I had my head down all the time. And I just as soon, if I did look up, I just as soon hit you person than look at them. And that's the rage in me at that time.
I used to break out in sweats. I'd be yelling. My dad finally put me in the caboose to sleep, because I wake up my brothers and sisters and that. So I used to sleep out there. And the only way I could forget that was get myself stoned, really drunk. And then I'd sleep till whenever sun up. But I used to, under the bed, I used to look, and there'd be a bottle there. I'd do it all over again. And I think as a result of war, a lot of the former guys that were in the war got into that,
I found him down on Skid Row in a ratty old hotel room. And he had a pair of pants that were long out of date, and a pair of boots that had certainly seen better times. We were talking, and I was asking him about the war, and he came to a part where he just could not talk anymore. He was completely overcome and overwhelmed with emotion at his memories. I said, "Thank you," and I just said his number and his rank, and Tommy stood up at attention. You want to stop? No, it's okay. And he clicked his heels together, and he saluted as though I was an officer. And he just turned around and walked out. And when you talked to him and when you listened to him, you had no choice but to respect him. That was an Aboriginal Indian soldier who fought for his land. Not the Queen's land, not the government's land, his land. That's what he fought for.
My men made it for me. And I'm proud. I'm proud to say it myself now that, you know something, my friend, I left a lot of men over there. The best cream of the crop, I said. And I'll say this now. They're responsible for Tommy Prince's life. They're good. 100%.
I was a veteran and of the Second World War. My father was a veteran of the First World War, and we never give it a thought that maybe we'd done something for our country, that we'd done something for our Indian people. Never realized that there would be a time when all us veterans would get together and start spearheading our path towards some recognition. We were elders, and we had some part of trying to do something for our people. Almost every one of us were sober at least 20 years. And each one of us had something to do in the courts, worked in the prisons, worked in the streets. And we all realized that we had to do something, that we had to be recognized first for ourselves, and we had to heal so we could go on and get stronger.
Well, Harry, let's go in and look at the old barracks there. See how they look, see if they...
It'll be the same as 45 years ago, you know.
Yeah,
Jim?
50 years ago.
Yeah. I wonder how many beds you have. I never counted them.
There must be a whole company in here, I think.
Mattresses.
As Aboriginal people, we are taught to pay tribute to our veterans. They carry the flag in the grand entry of our powwows, and they carry the memories of those we lost. In Vancouver, at Douglas College, a group of Native students offers eagle feathers to our soldiers, to our warriors. We pray they will have quiet hearts and maybe someday the recognition of Canada.
one of the first, one of the women that went from Muskeg. I think she was the first to join the army. My uncle Bill and his brother Stanley. Alexander Tophusim is Clifford and Wallace's dad, I think. George was one of the 9 brothers that volunteered for the Second World War. Joseph, another, and Emil still lives in Saskatoon.
It's not that long ago, you know, that Crees thought very highly of their warriors, the people who stood up to defend themselves against the Blackfoot, the Dene from up north, the Sarcee. It's barely 100 years ago that this was happening. They were a very important part of the community. They were a very necessary part for survival. So I think some of that spirit has been carried through to the present day.
I grew up on the reserve here, and Dad's army experience has always been, well, it's just a part of him. And we always kind of accepted it, and when we were growing up, like it was just accepted that we had a lot of veterans. But as we got older and on our own, we began to realize that hey, we got something pretty special here.
The memorial, I guess it's our way of saying, you know, we recognize the contribution you've made to not just this community, but the country in general. As far back as I can remember, the people, the men and the women who had joined the Army over the years have always been important people in the community. They've been given recognition by the community, a general recognition.
But Canada forgot its native soldiers. It took Canada almost 50 years to finally invite Aboriginal veterans to officially lay a wreath in the nation's capital, Ottawa, on Remembrance Day.
But we hope that this pilgrimage will allow us to recover by coming to visit those of our relatives and friends who are buried here in all of the cemeteries in Europe. I would like to do the prayer song once again as we bow our heads. O Hilo, Hilo, O Hilo, Hilo.
A group of our veterans traveled overseas to give recognition and remembrance to those they left behind in the cemeteries and on the battlefields.
We ask in memory of our fallen comrades, Almighty Father, who has set within thine own authority the times and reasons which are unknown to us, receive our prayer for thy servants departed. Return their souls in thy keeping. Pardon all that has been amiss, and draw them nearer to thyself, for the merits of Señor Jesus Christ our Savior. Amen. O thou who art heroic, love, kindle, we pray thee, in our hearts.
We ended up in Normandy Beach, and that we formed a miracle of a sacred circle right on Normandy beaches where the Canadians attacked in 1944. And one of our comrades, Al Thomas, left the sacred circle. We called him, and he says, "I can't stand it," he says. And he was bawling, and he was telling us about a buddy that died on his lap, and he came back to the sacred circle, and we all bawled like babies. While we were hugging each other, we were crying, and after all that was over, we never thought much of it, except later on we started to feel that we start healing, because we all opened our hearts and got emotional, and it helped us open our hearts so we could maybe talk about some of the things that we held back in our hearts and our minds all these years. But I wanted to bring this experience in my Second World War because it wasn't a waste of time. And I believe it was my destiny to go over there. I believe I wouldn't be alive today if I hadn't went through that experience. Watch your step now.
Don't fall down, eh?
Yeah, break our neck. Well, a little bit.
How'd
now.
you like to be back in Antwerp?
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Yeah.
We went over there.
Yeah.
And yeah, I liked it over there. You know, riding around in a bus there, singing
Yeah.
a song.
Yeah.
Don't keep looking around at the park here.
Kinanaskum gauna kiortat kagi tsiregnuden tunet. Tremage gavehats tuskaim nog. We owe you so much for protecting our land. We hope that our future generations don't have to experience the same thing, to see what you saw.